like to thank the organizers, Abed, Chair, and the rest, Danke, for this invitation. It's an honor to speak here. Can you hear me well? Let me just make sure. It's a dead hour. Let me try to entertain you. My colleague, Sipewe, will fill in and give it away. So I asked him to tell me thumbs up if I have to turn up the volume, right? So I've been asked to speak about the history of the South African Journal of Philosophy. You may have noticed that Abed didn't give a history, a shortcut history on the journal, because there is none. There is none published, as you will find out. And also what its role is in the formation of African philosophy. And I think it has a very modest role. So I'm going to invent probably a lot of what could have been done, and we'll speak mostly about what has not been done. Then I'll also speak about the focus or foci of the South African philosophy, South African philosophy, and at the end, I think we will end up with more questions than answers I could deliver. So here we go. I don't have it here, but if you look into the website, it's significant that you will read that the aim of the journal, and I think you have said it, is to publish originally, I'm quoting, a scholarly contribution. Now, it's the official publication of the Philosophical Society of Southern Africa, the PSSA. So I'm not going to say the whole name again, is the PSSA. This is the Philosophical Society of Southern Africa. Please note that. It is said to be the official publication of that society, and its aim is to contribute, or to publish contributions in all areas of philosophy, all areas. So that's the focus. It's a generalist kind of journal at an international standard, so that's important. It's opening up its audience there. And further, the wide scope, I'm quoting, of the South African Journal of Philosophy makes it the continent's central vehicle for the publication of general philosophical work. My colleague here will contest that immediately. And end of quote, okay? Now, this looks like, at the first glance, simple, informative statements, right? And it doesn't seem to be something very uncontroversial about it. Unless you have already noted that I think there may be something controversial about it. So you will ask yourself, why should I entertain you in the South African Journal of Philosophy if there's nothing controversial about its claims and there's little to say about it? And maybe it does seem like it, but I think there is a very interesting history to tell, and I'm going to try to tell something about it today. So let me start here. I think the two claims made there are very controversial. That's part of the interesting history. So the first claim is that it is the official publication of the Philosophical Society of Southern Africa. Now, you will say, well, why is that an interesting claim? I will tell you in a minute. The second claim is that it has a wide scope, and like I indicated, it is the central vehicle for the publication of general philosophical work. That is a controversial claim, and I think if we consider these claims, they say a lot about the history of the journal. And it says a lot in Rebound, if you look at them, about why the journal could be considered controversial, and it is, right? In fact, to talk about the journal means to talk about its history. And it means to talk about its host, the PSSA. And I'm going to try to talk about both of them. So it is a seminal question to ask, what role did the SAJP play in the formation of philosophy in South Africa and philosophy in the South African context? What role does it play in the formation of African philosophy in particular? Ultimately, I think these questions means to talk about the very theme of this conference, and that is, or this workshop, It means to talk about the places of African philosophies, specifically the place of the South African Journal of Philosophy in the history of African philosophy. So a short note on methodology is in order. I'm not going to try to give you a strict attempt to talk about the South African Journal of Philosophy. So what follows is not an informative historical account or an attempt to do that. I think that would be interesting. I think somebody should do that job, which is not me. For instance, one could try to trace the history of the journal, in part by looking at its issues. You've already done a historian's job there, right? Some bad news on that is only half of the journal issues are digitalized. So you have to look for some archives, and they are basically in private possession. And I think some universities might have some of the issues. So somebody can go to South Africa if you have a PhD in mind. There you go. Sit in libraries and try to find out what's going on there. As for its further history, I think there's no publication on its history like we have with the other journals. So nobody knows. So what you know about the history is basically what you get from hearsay, so from previous editors. So there's really a job to be done. And I have the privilege to have worked with most of them, except for the very first one. So from the second one in 2000, I can name you all, I can describe them all, and you may find that interesting gossip. I can tell you some stories about them. But that's not what I'm going to do today. So all of them until the current editor, right? So if you pay me a nice beer or wine, I could tell you a lot about that, but not today. I can tell you some boring stuff, like for instance, his first publisher was the Bureau for Scientific Publications in 1981. It seems it's 1981. And we can talk about the Bureau and how it fits in, but that's also not what I'm going to talk about. And then it was published by TextCore, a dubious kind of cottage publisher. Some would call it not a cottage publisher in 2000. And then I can talk a lot about the sweat to get it published by Taylor Francis in 2013. This is the time when I was editor, and my claim to fame is that I brought it from TextCore, the cottage publisher, to the commercial publisher called Taylor Francis. And then my talk could end with some soppy stories, and that was it, right? And what I'm not going to do is all of that. Rather, what I'm going to talk about is the essay by JP by focusing on its place of publication, or as a place of publication. So basically, I'm going to talk about the place of the South African Journal of Philosophy in history and in its current context. So already there we go with the concept of place. So I'm going to make two main assumptions about place. So don't worry, I'm not really going to talk about place. I'm just going to talk about the SHP and demonstrate something about place. That's basically what this whole talk is up to. So there are two basic assumptions I'm going to make about place. So unlike Bruce, I'm not going to, be as open and say there are many assumptions to make about what place is. I concentrate on two. The first is that place is the grounding of any lived experience, including philosophical engagement. Every philosopher is grounded in place. That's the first claim. It's controversial. Analytic philosophers don't like it. Second, I think that displacement is always at work in place. So Bruce has not said much about displacement, but I think this is a topic that really needs to be addressed. And this is the kind of topic I have concentrated on in writing on place. So what I understand by displacement is both the action that makes it possible for subjects to position themselves and settle in a place. Okay? That's the positive connection, as well as the unsettling condition that pushes subject to reposition themselves. and maybe to change places. The worst scenario is forced removal, as we have seen in South Africa. So such displacement has both positive content, it's a creative enabling force, and it has a destructive disenabling dynamics. And I think that is at work at the roots of any place, any concept of place. Right? So these are my assumptions, and we can talk about them. I call my whole approach, if you want to know, I'm using a very ugly word for it, but I call it dystopology. It's related to topology, so Jans and Malpass speak about topology, and the focus there is on what matters in and about a place. My focus is on the destructive sense of being placed. So one could say to some extent that dystopology is a heuristic method. So it's a strategy. I'm going to demonstrate the strategy by talking about the SHAP. It's a strategy which helps us to account for the displacement in any place of work. So I'm going to read the SHAP through, or the history of the SHAP, through the lenses of the philosophy of displacement. So I'm going to focus on three situations in which I think disenabling forces can be observed at work in the historic formation of the SHAP. And so also in the formation of the PSSA that hosts the SHAP. So recall, PSSA means Philosophical Society of Southern Africa, not only South Africa, big claim, Southern Africa, and the SHAP stands for the South African Journal of Philosophy. And I also hope to be focusing open up a debate on the enabling forces and not only the disenabling forces at work in all of this. So for this history, I'm going to rely on personal accounts, my own experience as well, and especially on, I don't know if you know the work of Mabogo More, it's a memoir, looking through philosophy in black memoirs. It was published in 2009-10. It's a great book to read. I recommend it. You can read it. It's a bedtime story because it's really telling a story about the history, but it will keep you awake. So perhaps not a good tip for a good bedtime story. So that book is going to guide most of what I'm going to do here. Okay, I'm not going to talk for an hour. I think it's set for 35 minutes or so. Here we go. Three situations. The first is the place of birth. All right, where was the South African? How was it SHAP born? Now, brace yourself. I said I'm going to talk about the PSSA as I talk about the SHAP. Right? Now, there's really, to the best of my knowledge, no documents written or published documents about its history, about its beginning. So my previous supervisor, Professor Anton van Niekerk, told me the other day, so I interviewed a lot of them, of the editors, and he gave me a very nice personal report about how things start in the beginning. So in the beginning there was Abraham Roux. Note all the whites talking here. We talk about South African philosophy during the times of apartheid, right? Now, Abraham Roux is interesting because he was the very first editor of the SHAP. He was at the same time, so you may recall, the co-editor of one of the very first anthologies on African philosophy, and that is the African Philosophy Reader. And in that reader, a lot of seminal African philosophers published. Viridu is one of them, Ramos is another one, I think Serikweberan was there, and so you can go on. So their papers were republished by the permission, of course. But to the best of my knowledge, none of these philosophers ever contributed to the SHAP in the years which would follow. Well, perhaps we would have found scattered publications of them, but they are hardly noticeable. And that is until 2010, more or less, right? In any case, Vernicker tells an interesting story. It's interesting because More writes a lot about it. For instance, that there were two philosophical societies in the 70s, the left wing. Now we're talking about the white philosophical society. The lefties, and they were sitting in Stellenbosch. Interesting that they were sitting in Stellenbosch. I was surprised to hear that. And at the University of Cape Town, that's more it, right? And then there was the right-wing society. They produced something like Dooyeweerd philosophy. It's a Dutch philosopher. They were pretty dubious, interesting partly, but mostly very conservative. And these right-wing philosophers were sitting in Potchefstroom today. It is actually a very vibrant philosophical society. Masolo was there the other day, for instance. He was hosted by them. There's also a dark side of the moon there, but we will talk about it. There's University of Bloemfontein, also quite different today, but it was one of those centers of Afrikaans-speaking philosophers. And Pretoria, which still is, but it housed a lot of African philosophers, which is interesting. There's an anomaly there. To speak about South Africa is to speak about anomalies, isn't it, Professor Simpiwe? Right, there we go. So then they merge, the consolidated forces. It was a tag used in the 80s. The Afrikaners and the English, decide that they have to support each other in this whole apartheid era to make the Lager stronger. And they were also, interestingly, divided. So the two societies were separate, not only by politics but also by philosophy. So one was more analytic, the other was more continental. And that division remains until today, as it is also internationally. And we know it internationally, right? We know it in Germany as well. So what is, however, particularly interesting is not what has been told now, but what Mabogo More reports about that time. And I'm going to go into two narratives here, which I find simply so compelling to talk about that I decided to single them out and make out of that history a bit of a story. His story, all right? So More tells us that the first time he encountered the PSSA was in the mid-70s. He was just appointed at the University of Turfloop. There's no Turfloop anymore. There's only the University of the North. That is what Turfloop was. So together with the University of Fort Hare, where I am from, and the University of Venda, Turfloop was one of those three historical black universities. And they were also called Bush universities. You can hear the derogatory language, right? And they were actually meant, they were established basically during 1959. Fort Hare was a bit older, but during that time, they were supported to do a very simple thing, and that is to prepare graduates, black graduates, remember they were black universities, to enter the Bantustan, the homelands, the workforce of that after the completion of bachelor degrees. So you basically educated young black students to serve the homelands, which were then meant actually to solidify the idea of separate ethnic and racial groups and what we basically called apartheid, right? So basically, it's, creating people in the bush to go back to the bush, separate from where we find white privileged universities. So the separate university in South Africa has become a notorious phenomenon, as you may know. So there are different categories of them: English, Afrikaans, this one, and then the rest, which was ethnic. So you had universities such as University of Fort Hare, and there people mainly spoke Xhosa. You have the University of Zululand, where people speak Zulu. And you have the University of the North, where Sothos, Tswanas, Tsongas, and Bendas would be taught. And then University of Durban Westville for Indians. And then at the end, the University of Western Cape for so-called coloureds. So, although universities in South Africa all cater inclusivity today, you will see that those divisions persist. they're very clear if you just take the effort and walk the campus of universities and listen to languages. They are there. They're a little bit like townships on the margins of South African towns, where the poor people are still living. Now, it is in this context, this is the background for two seminal things that happened to More. So here's the first event. He decided to go to his first, remember he's a young lecturer, just appointed in Turfloop, University of the North. And then in 1976, he decided to attend the Philosophical Society of South Africa, Southern Africa, right? Conference, the annual conference. It was the third annual conference. It's right in the beginning. So I went there with a colleague, Chinswalo George Mashambe. He was later sent to Robben Island for political activities. So here are the two black philosophers going to this conference. Everybody was white. White English, white Afrikaans. And then a certain Professor Dreyer from the University of Pretoria heard about the two blacks attending, and his University of Pretoria was just too white for them, and he refused. So the University of South Africa, that is also called UNISA, decided to take it over. But then, learning about Dreyer's position and the resistance there, the two decided not to go. Not to go. Then came the second seminal event, the fourth big event. Remember, the PSSA is the host of the SHJP. We talk about the host. And it still is the host of the SHJP. Right. So I'm building up the tension here. Then something remarkable happened, and that is, no, it's not remarkable. It's much worse than that. It was 1977, and More gave it another shot. And he went to Potchefstroom. Now, Potchefstroom was at that stage the Center for Christian Higher Education, nationalist education. You must be Afrikaans, the Christian, and then you're part of the elected, pretty much like the Jews, you enter the society of the 144 elected, kind of that. That was really the ball game. But the child we were all trying to be good to be part of the elected, So that's the university where all those people would go. Today, like I said, it's quite different. But they were really very conservative Afrikaners. And More still went there. He decided he will join the team. So, it was problematic from the outset. It was during the Biko times. the Biko protests were in 1976. And he was quite an attraction, right? But not for philosophical reasons, but for political reasons. So all of a sudden he had to act, like I said, as if he was the expert on all political issues in South Africa, the old protesting included, which one could perhaps understand, but here's the problematic part. One would think here that in his account, that there's a W.E.B. Du Bois moment. He was philosophically uninteresting, but politically interesting because basically being black was a problem. See, this is really what happened there. So in the wake of the 76 Soweto student revolts, the white philosophers at the PSSA conference were very concerned about what was happening. And they were very concerned about what was driving it. Philosophers want to know what drives things. And they found out it's because black consciousness that drives things. And similar to Du Bois' philosophical concept of double consciousness, they found out that this was the philosophical concept that, for my own thesis about place, is very important, that shaped the situation of apartheid. It was the philosophical concept, that was shaped by apartheid. It didn't shape apartheid, it did in the rainbow rebound. It was shaped by apartheid. And in this situation now, and I come to the core things, More encountered two things that really shocked him. He said, shocked, all right? The one shock came as a kind of pleasant surprise. The surprise was that there was a professor under the Tuig from Stellenbosch that spoke in English. That was already a surprise. The second surprise, part of the pleasant surprise, was he was speaking in the town hall. So it was like we all go to the Rathaus, the townhouse here, and there the philosopher speaks. And then the shocking thing came for the Afrikaners, very unpleasant, or English there, for the blacks, that one black person in a sea of white people. It was quite interesting. The Tuig said that, and I'm going to cite him, that philosophers, particularly the English analytical tradition, have issued their social function and responsibility. That is, they have comfortably stayed out of politics. I want to emphasize that. Isn't that the tag we still hear today? So he used Hegel and Marx and Weber to call, and I'm quoting again, for an authentic social function and vocation of philosophy. And he also committed the big sin, and I'm quoting again, the concept, now I'm quoting More again, of black consciousness, to argue that this concept presents South African philosophers, white philosophers, with a process of emerging social and political cultural consciousness, end of quote. So, and that should challenge them to rethink the nature, social function, and responsibility of philosophy. Now, Maury doesn't clearly say what shocked him, right? But it's all there. It's hard. It's easy to imagine, because what you basically have is a white philosopher speaking the townhouse, speaking English, and using the concept of black consciousness to awaken philosophical engagement in place. So it's a black consciousness. The very concept that caused the problem was now used as a possible solution to the problem. But that was just a pleasant surprise. Now comes the bad surprise. So More recounts that at the conference, there was a tea break on the third day, and usually these conferences are about 3 days long. So he went during the tea break, where everyone went for tea, and he just didn't feel like a tea, so he took a Coca-Cola. He wanted to take one. So he went to the cafeteria and to buy himself a Coca-Cola, like all the rest did. And then, and I'm going to quote him, if you pardon me to do this, because I'm not going to do it myself. And then there was a white woman cashier behind the counter, quoting, told me straight to my face, in the presence of some white philosophers, including the head of philosophy at UNISA, René Meyer, who knew me because I was a registered MA degree student in his department, that covers cannot buy inside, but have this small window counter outside the wall. None of these philosophers really made a fuss about this, except to mumble some few embarrassed words to the cashier that I was part of the group. I didn't attend the following sessions and went home. That was the last time I attended the South African Philosophy Conference. All right, that was situation one. I'm moving to situation two. I call it movement in the political space. So More again, he was now reflecting in 1996 about what happened then, about the social and institutional milieu, note, that produced me as a philosopher. So the philosophy of place is really so clearly, or the philosophy of displacement, demonstrated by this single statement. So More recounts that his work was progressively concentrated on, had been progressively concentrated on the problem of racism, and one can exactly understand that. How from a particular concept, from a particular place, particular concepts were were stimulated to be born and to be reflected upon. It is clear that experiences of racism thus, such as the third and fourth PSSA conferences, had a very formative effect on the particular work that he would focus on, and thus who he would become as philosopher. So I think this whole idea of place being the grounding situation, or the grounding of philosophy is, for a lot of philosophers, simply unacceptable. I've attended conferences where they really take issue with it. And I think, I don't believe in the continental analytic divide very much. I think it's a silly thing to do in discussions, they bridge it. So it's just jargon. I think it's a childish play. And give me for that, but some of them, some colleagues wouldn't speak to each other. And I come back to that. I've seen it happening, and you will have seen it happening. But I think here's an issue where I think some analytic philosophers would agree. We could clearly say, but this is where a particular context really gave rise to the kind of philosophy we end up doing. I wouldn't have done this philosophy if I wouldn't have been in South Africa, for instance. And I wouldn't have spoken here today if I wouldn't have been shaped by that. So he published a paper in 1996 entitled Complicity, Neutrality or Advocacy, a review of Stay Out of Politics. And he would, in this paper, elaborate on his reflections on racism at these conferences, the PSSA conferences, and how white philosophers of South Africa were morally responsible for apartheid by staying out of politics, by not being shaped by place, one could say. Thus, by tacitly, I would say clearly, taking the position that philosophy and politics do not mix, and therefore a philosopher's job is not to involve him or herself in politics, even in the face of social injustices, political repressions and oppression. That was actually not me, that was More. But I think I've read so much More that I can, recitate in my sleep. And I'm going to cite him once more. South African philosophers individually and collectively did definitely at no difficulty staying out of politics. I'm going to end my talk with this sentence. But I'm not yet there. So the problem persisted, and according to him, also post-1994, that is post the time when South Africa became a democratic country, the problem persisted. And interestingly now, he demonstrates this claim with reference to two major philosophical journals in South Africa. The one is Philosophical Papers. It's an analytic journal, mostly from its beginning a host for English analytic philosophy. And then there was the South African Journal of Philosophy, which had an Afrikaans name in the beginning, by the way. It was actually the publishing house for mostly Afrikaans philosophers. So, and he uses them to say the following. Here follows a quote: "The ability to stay out of politics, I contend, still persists, moral and political posturing enshrined in the mission and policy statements of the only two South African journals, philosophy journals notwithstanding." So these journals write, for instance, the SAJP, that they are committed to the achievement of, I'm quoting, "a just and democratic South Africa where there is no discrimination on the grounds of race, gender, or creed." One would think, hey, the South African Journal of Philosophy has moved on. It was 1996, and this is what they write. So it's a statement against racism. And now I'm going to quote once more, if you don't mind, More's story. "Yet, when a member of the philosophical community was gunned down by the agents of apartheid, when a member of the society was arrested and sentenced to 10 years in Robben Island, still when another member was harassed, repeatedly detained by the security police, all of them for regarding the policy of apartheid as an infringement of," and he's quoting now the journals, "of human, civil, and academic rights, and an affront to their human dignity, and committed to the achievement of a just and democratic South Africa, where there will be no discrimination on the grounds of race, gender, or creed. South African philosophers, individually and collectively, definitely had no difficulty staying out of politics, end of quote. So this staying out of politics happened by colleagues who were experiencing what has just been said about the powers that be. Now, needless to say, his criticism was not simply confined to the time, and it was actually voiced in a plethora of anti-racist voices among black philosophers. But interestingly, and he says it with a nice lot of irony, shortly after he published that in 1996, he was invited, well, he was just simply appointed by the South African Journal of Philosophy to be part of the editorial board. He, together with Joe Teffer, who later became the president of the Philosophical Society of Southern Africa. And that was despite the fact that they never attended any conferences. They were never part of the philosophical community. So, of course, it's simply a bit of window dressing purposes. And I'm quoting here, I think much more for window dressing purposes than for any other reason as such. Because even today, philosophy in the country remains the most untransformed discipline. End of quote. Now, during this time, Joe Teffer was then elected as PSSA president, a kind of prestigious position at the time, the very first black philosophy president there. In inaugural lectures in 1997, it was, I think, at Afrikaans University, and then in Port Elizabeth as well in 1998. However, More is once again very skeptical, and I'm quoting once again, in my view, this appointment was tokenism at its best. And then he goes on giving some evidence about why he thinks even in 2019 this remained a kind of tokenism. So he was saying that he said that notably in 2019, that despite the fact that we see blacks appointed as vice-chancellors, right, or rectors as they're called in South Africa, and I'm quoting, the councils, the senates, the faculties, the departments, and the lecturers, all structures wielding actual power and not simply rubber stampers, they are still predominantly white and white dominated. And I think that has remained the same until today. So now we go to situation 3, the last one. And yeah, I think I'm going to give you a bit more of a personal account. So over 2 decades after More published, so you must think of More in the 70s, More in 1996, think about the 70s, and thinking that after that, not much has changed until 2016. Now we reached 2016-17, and he said that during that time, a group of young black philosophers, and I quote, were sick to their stomachs about the continuing subtle racism and marginalization of African philosophy, end of quote, by the PSSA. And they decided to not only boycott the PSSA conference of 2017, but to form their own philosophical society. It was called the Azanian Philosophical Society. And its first inaugural conference happened in August 2017. Now, it's important to say a bit more about the background of this and what happened, especially between 2000 and 2017, and then in 2016 at the PSSA. Okay, so let me tell you my own story. So I did my PhD in Germany, in Tübingen, and when I returned in 1999, after a decade, I was kind of naively taken aback by I took up a postdoc at Stellenbosch University, and I was taken aback by how white the student population has remained. So that was naive, right? And, 25 years later, if you go to Stellenbosch, it pretty much looks the same. They don't like you saying it, but it's true enough. walk there with colleagues like Paul van Tongeren from Nijmegen, and we would make the very same observation. It's a sea of white. The black students are some students outside Stellenbosch. I've been there in October, so it's quite recent, right? To give a talk. And I can talk about that a lot, but not now. But I thought in that stage, in the philosophical community, it would be different, right? Philosophers think, they transform things. So I went to my first PSSA conference, that was 1999, and it was just conspicuous that at the dinner in the evening, there were 3 tables. And a big table, and there were, 2 big tables and a small table. One of the big tables were the English analytic philosophers, and at the other table, the Afrikaans, more continental philosophers. They didn't talk to each other much. They also have a history of their own. And then there was a smaller table with some international philosophers. They like to go to Stellenbosch for vacation, so they all flock there. And then a small group of black philosophers. And I found myself at the small table wondering what was happening. All right, that was the first thing. And during the papers, what has happened is the 3 tables would attend each other's papers, more or less, right? Then the same would go for attendance of papers, not only attendance of papers, but interaction. So during breaks, you will see people flocking together in these little groups. I think South Africa has made out of me a sociologist. But this kind of tripartite structure, I call it tripartite. It's a little bit an allusion to the 3 champions of Africa at the stage. But let's not talk about that. But basically, the 3 kinds of contributors would also contribute to the South African Journal of Philosophy. You would see English analytic, Afrikaans speak continental, and then a few scattered international and also black African philosophy papers, right? And that, I speak about 1999, and I think that has remained the situation and also the issue for quite a long time. It looked like the PSA was basically taking over, the philosophers, the kind of structure we had in South Africa as well. So that if you travel through South Africa, until today you have a kind of tripartite, or with the English part sitting in one place of town, the Afrikaans, and then things are getting mixed with mixed schools, and then in the townships, it's all the other colours and the rainbow, and the richer colours are now also a bit part of town, but now people, the rich other colours also go to the townships and buy themselves nice houses there. So this is a bit of a development. It looked like philosophy was just simply taking over what was happening there. This is a kind of observation More underlines later also in his book. All right, so that has not changed much. I organized my first PSA conference in 2001. So if I speak against, or sound like I'm against, it's a dubious role I played. I was secretary of the PSA for 3 years. I organized 3 conferences of it, or co-organized 3 of them. I was a very active man in it, and I was also the editor of the South African Journal of Philosophy. So I was very active and passionately trying to develop philosophy in South Africa. And part of, during my time, what we thought might help to Africanize the whole thing. But let's not talk about that. Let's talk about my own scandal. So here comes a confession. 2016, I was one of the organizing members of the infamous, the very notorious PSI conference of 2016. So this is what has happened. At that stage, my time as editor of the South African Journal of Philosophy was just over. And during that time, I was quite proud to see that there was a surge in the publications of African philosophy. At Fort Hare, this is what we fostered, with my colleague John Lamola. We really pushed for it. And we wouldn't reject papers, but let them be reworked several times. We tried to publish special issues. We would solicit contributions from African philosophers. All just, small little white efforts, but we tried with the help of John Lamola. I was proud to be part of that. I was proud to be at that university. And then I was part of this committee, and we organized this conference, and there was one panel about South African identity. South African identity, what do you think? What will happen? We had the names there, and the program was fine. The conference ran really smooth. A number of black attendants there, so contrary to other years. And when I was sitting in the audience, my colleagues who organized it with me, together with me, realized that the whole panel was white on South African identity. We did not see it. We were at the program. We didn't see by so-called oversight. What is that blind side? What do you call it? It's evil. I'm ashamed to say it today, but I will do it. This is my personal disclaimer now. We didn't see it. We were so used to it, to those programs where there are white names. We just didn't notice that that was the topic and those were the names. So I issued a public apology and found in all possible terms. But what can you say? It's words beyond rich. It's just shame. And I'm talking about colleagues who were themselves, working, high five, yes, working towards that. And I think that was just a turnaround, together with other events in the country, and it triggered a heated discussion in the Philosophical Society about its racism. That was together with the Fees Must Fall movement, you will be aware of, which started in 2015. And then came the 2017 PSSA conference, one of the big scandals. And there, two young men, Tabang Tlatla and Diesel Tlatla, were sitting in an audience, a sea of white philosophers, and they spoke to the audience about the experience of racism in South African departments of philosophy and in the Philosophical Society. And there was a debate, there was a bit of a discussion. Next to me sat my colleague, John Lamola. He's now chef of the South African Airways, if you want to know that, and still he's a co-founder of the Center for African Philosophy in South Africa. So. And he challenged the PSA. He stood up, challenged them to take seriously the charge of racism. And at a point, the core of the discussion focused on asking the two young black men, very brave, they were postgrads, to address the audience, very brave. They kind of asked them to prove where there was racism targeted against them. I'm in pay. Prove it. That was the kind of response. John stood up and resigned publicly. And I followed suit right there, trying to make it good. And we published it on the PSA, on the South African Journal. No, the South African Philosophies, it's independent from the PSA. It's a ZA full, the online group. We published it there, and it was also published in some journal. I can't remember where. And that was the last time John attended the PSA conferences, and that also goes for myself. So I've never been there again. Most senior philosophers in the country, black philosophers, wouldn't go there either. And what I hear from other colleagues who would go there is that it's the same tripartite structure still. So interestingly, I asked in Rome last year, I asked some of the colleagues from University of the North, that was Poch. I heard that the PSA was still very white instead of more. Oh no, they didn't notice. No. Imagine what color the people had who said that. They didn't notice. You don't notice because you're white and you're so used to whiteness, right? All right. So things have changed a bit. So after my time, it was Andrea Hurst who took over, then Etienne Yebo, and during that time, there were a lot of publications on African philosophy followed. And interestingly, 6 out of 11 special issues were on themes in African philosophy. That's something, right? So there is some change happening. And in the near future, there will be this year, in the 3rd issue of the South African philosophy, a special issue on the work of Mabogo More. I'm privileged to also take part in that. And then there will be another issue on African ecophenomenology, which is planned to appear in the 2026 issue, the 2nd one. So I think that adds to the special issues in African philosophy. That's on a good note. I'm going to take 30 seconds to end on a sad note. So one could say there's an enabling force going on, so the positive part of displacement. But here comes the negative part again. So quite recently, Motsamai Molefe, he was the successor of Etienne Etiebo, the 2nd last editor in charge, was removed as editor in charge from the editorial board, I think after 2 years of service, or 3, he has another year. So he was my colleague, and I was one of the persons to push him to be going there. And he told me, he wrote that he was removed in a very arrogant and disrespectful fashion, right? Now, there were some administrative issues with the SAGP, so some things went wrong, there was a backlog, and there were a discussion, and Motsamai told me that he offered to them that he would resign, and they did not accept the exco. Now, this exco is predominantly white, like the whole Philosophical Society, and this whole thing was reported at the 2025 AGM, where one of the editors, my colleague Chris Ozerbroek, was also, and he said he will never go again. And basically, they charged him not to have run the journal efficiently. That was where it stopped. The point is, it should have never happened. So predominantly white exco fired a black editor. I call it the epitome of what displacement in its worst form is, forced removal. He was forcibly removed. He did not want me to take it up with the issue, so I wanted to take it up with him with a very strong articulation. A white man should not be needed to ask another white man to pardon a black man. So I left it there. As always, it is easy for white philosophers to stay out of politics, right? Thank you.
I would say just 2 questions, and then we will have a short break. Or, okay, Albert.
I have just one question that can be shared with the 2 first and the last presenter is about the financial place, versus space. How far does the finance contribute or disadvantage the production of philosophy, particularly through publishing houses and journals?
That's a very good question. Shall I? So one of the reasons why we moved to Taylor, France is it was more affordable. So the South African government in the beginning supported the Bureau for Publications, and that made it possible to publish the journal, but it became too expensive when they withdrew, and that was in the 80s, right? 90s. And in 2000, they had a private, Texel was basically a private company supported by the academy. And that didn't work, so they had to charge page fees, and it caused a lot of trouble. People complained about it, and a lot of black scholars couldn't contribute, but we pardoned such people, for instance, by charging on institutions, so people who had institutional support. But it was a complicated matter. And Taylor Francis made it much easier to handle the page fees and not to make it so high. Otherwise, it couldn't have happened. So you can, it's like other journals, you can have open access and pay for it, or your institution pay. If you can't pay, if you don't have that kind of support, you're not charged. So in that sense, finance shouldn't play such a role.
Okay.
Thank you very much for giving us insights into this complex, difficult, and painful history of the South African Society of Philosophy and also the Journal of Philosophy of South Africa. Now, you didn't want to give a chronological account or narrative, what is perfectly okay. In face of this very complex situation. However, I would like to know, since the South African Journal was established in the 1980s, as you say, do you know when was the first article about Black philosophy, African philosophies of Africa included there? So when was, so to say, the breakthrough that it was accepted that something like Black philosophy or African philosophy exists in the journal?
I don't know. I couldn't access those issues. I thought I have them. And it turned out that I did not. So the hard copies are in some places. So and I couldn't look into them. So I can't say when that happened the first time. I actually asked ChatGPT if they would know, and they also didn't know because they only pick up and publish stuff. But that's an interesting question. And of course, one could also take the trouble, which I did not. So I didn't do my historical homework. I didn't look through all the issues and try to trace what percentage of that. So don't ask that question, I don't know. And I think if you've asked me to do that, I would have said, I would have asked my assistant perhaps. But it's quite a laborious task. But it is an interesting task and historians should pick up. Yes, that's interesting. I think Ramo's at the stage, when he published in 2016, he charged the SHAP for epistemicide. I think he had also Etienne Iyebo and his methodology in African philosophy. In 2017, they did give us some numbers, the statistics.
Oh, okay.
But as I changed my venue, but they spoke about different issues, how many philosophy courses are offered in the country. There's an interesting paper on that. You can check for his statistics. I didn't do that because I didn't want to go that way. I hope that's fine with him.
Yeah, perfectly fine. Was just curiosity, maybe to know when was the first article on African philosophy.
I would also like to know.
Okay.
Thank you, Abraham.
Sure.
So we'll have 15 minutes of break.